Welcome. Today, Chuck and Brock enjoy spending time with Professor Dominic Perler's Chapter 28, Skepticism, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. This is Generous Theology.
This chapter is one of the most anticipated chapters for me personally. We're in chapter 28 of the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. This is chapter 28, Skepticism, by Professor Dominic Perler. And Chuck, I have a little bit of a reputation for saying whichever chapter we're in is probably my favorite chapter. And I have to plead a little bit guilty to that. But I have to say, this chapter was one of my favorite chapters. And it was one of the ones I anticipated the most, because if there's any sort of one issue where philosophy hinges and the sort of back and forth engagements between believers and non-believers hinges, it goes to this idea of being skeptical. What is skepticism? What's its role in intellectual inquiry? And to what degree should we be skeptical of which thing? And good luck with an easy answer to that, because, of course, this is a long and storied situation in philosophy. And so for you or I to say, we'll just solve that here and just put down a simple answer that's going to resolve all of the tensions in the discussions over the last 2,000 plus years is naive. Having said that, of course, we're going to have positions. Of course, we're going to have opinions. And of course, we want to engage with some of the main points here. So I'm going to do standard. Let's open it up. What came before in the Middle Ages? What was behind? What was the stage like when the medievals came onto the stage and interacted and did things? And of course, we'll probably have a discussion where we do the same, talking about what happened after the medievals. What was their impact? Where did it go? Where did it develop? Where are things today? And so that's at a high level there. But before I started down that familiar pathway, I just wanted to open it up to you to get some initial thoughts and where you've come at with the topic over your years of interacting with it.
Yeah, so I would note, first of all, that I really appreciated, I think his framework, talking about skepticism in a couple of different ways, was really helpful. He points out at the very beginning of the chapter that there was no philosopher in the Christian tradition who radically doubted or even denied the possibility that human beings can have knowledge. And he then broadens that out to talk about the Jewish and Islamic tradition as well. And that fits a little bit what we know. We probably did not expect skepticism to be a key part of the philosophy of the medievals. We think of that as coming later. But of course, Perler points out that a philosopher can take a skeptical position by straightforwardly rejecting the thesis that knowledge is possible and systematically destroying knowledge claims, and what's happened in some cases in the modern era. But he also talks then about the skeptical method, where you can present argument that might refute a certain conception of knowledge and attempt to introduce a new one that maybe would give a better explanation of what knowledge is and how it acquired, and pointed out that skeptical method was not unknown to the medievals. It's just that they weren't willing to go all the way and take a skeptical position. So they had those arguments. And I thought that was helpful, thinking about it. And then it also then some sense that it's not like skeptical arguments suddenly were invented by the modern. There were certainly skeptical arguments made before that. And Perler talks about Pyrrhonism, ancient skepticism that aimed to show how one can reach mental tranquility by suspending all beliefs, and the fact that even some of that Pyrrhonism was attacked and dealt with by Cicero and Augustine. Like it says in the Bible, there's nothing new under the sun. These skeptical positions were out there, but of course, the way that skepticism was used by the medievals is very different today. And I just found that to be a very helpful way of thinking about it. You don't have to be a total skeptic as far as your position, saying it's impossible to have complete belief or complete knowledge, but you can still include these skeptical methods in helping you to make arguments. So I found that to be full.
So setting the stage here, which you've done very nicely, Chuck, thank you for that. There's an idea that intellectual inquiry ought to include some degree of doubt as to certain things, and some degree of rigor should be applied to the process of epistemology. How is it that people know what they know? Now, we're still setting the stage here, so I don't think we necessarily have to get into deep arguments, because first of all, it's very important to just frame the issue. And from the Christian perspective, I want to establish a certain frame right away. Now, it's going to be a frame that we Christians are going to accept and insist that we use in understanding reality, and it's going to be a frame that non-believers, especially skeptics and especially atheists or anti-theists, will be pushing against. And so we're going to examine some of the pieces of that conflict, I think, to try to help us make sense of A, what's at stake, and then B, how the engagement ought to happen or ought to go. And so to do this, I just wanted to open up the Christian frame by going back to Genesis chapter 3. I'm going to read just enough to get us bootstrapped into what's at stake and take the major Christian territory in this discussion. And just starting with verse 1, it says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. The serpent said to the woman, 'Did God really say, you must not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat fruit from the tree in the garden. But God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.' The serpent said to the woman, 'You will not certainly die, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" Now, Chuck, I think this has to be one of the saddest texts in all of human history. People are prone to overstate, including myself, how I joke at the beginning of the session that this chapter is, always joke that this chapter is the most important chapter of all, but it's really hard to overstate what's at stake here. Now, the linkage that I just wanted to bring out very early, the initial linkage, is this perceived close relationship between skepticism and unbelief. They're close in meaning, and I think linked very closely in terms of the inquiry. However, there's perhaps a subtle or a nuanced distinction between the two that I want to point out here. And so in the first part of the text, verse 1, the serpent asked the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" Now, this is the serpent being skeptical. And so there's a question. The serpent is interrogating the woman with a challenge to a position. And if we go down to verse 4, we see that the challenge, the skeptical challenge, is followed up with a statement of antithesis. So in verse 1, the serpent asks, "Did God really say?" But in verse 4, the serpent says, "You will not certainly die." In other words, God has not told you the truth. And so the serpent comes out with a statement of unbelief, or with what we call antithesis. And so the link there is so close that we as believers really have to respect and understand this crucial link and the importance of what's at stake in even considering it, as opposed to being, for example, naive or blasé about the nature of skepticism. So, Chuck, if you think about it, with a pastor's heart, where do you go to when you want to frame these kinds of issues and you want to bootstrap this kind of discussion?
I would say that where I've thought about these things is less in terms of skeptical argument and more in terms of how do you deal pastorally with people who have doubt, right? And that is a little bit of a different circumstance. And yet there is some level of connection as well, because I think there is a sense in which the skepticism of today's age can lead to certain types of doubts that can weigh heavily on people. And where I've often gone is to point out that doubt, in my mind, doubt is not the opposite of faith, because one can still trust even when they have doubt. And that what is really important in one's faith in God is a trust. We may not fully understand how God works. We may even have some doubts in our own minds about certain ideas of God. And yet, I think as Christians, we're called to trust. And I think of that old Sunday school song, "Trust and Obey. There's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey." And there is a real value in that idea of trust, even when you're not sure. And so that's how I've often pastorally dealt with those kinds of issues. And I can say myself, there have been times when I've had doubts about certain issues, maybe not doubts about whether God exists or doubts about salvation per se, but doubts about certain types of things. And it's always been helpful to me then, again, to rely on trust, to look at, there are some Psalms where King David talks about this idea of trust. And often he'll look back to the past and he'll say, God has always been on our side. He's always proven himself to be faithful. And so going forward, even as my enemies surround me and even if things bad, I still trust in him. And so speaking pastorally, that's where I've gone. Now, we're talking now a little bit in this more philosophical context. It may be a little bit different, but I think the connection here is, and why I found that initial piece where Perler lays out the difference between a skeptical position and a skeptical method as being helpful, is that I think most people have experienced levels of doubt about whatever. We're not even necessarily talking about faith issues. People have had doubts about, and we can actually use the fact that at times we have some doubts. We don't know where knowledge is coming from, and we can use that in a positive way, whether it's the Missouri show me. I get accused of that a lot of times by my own family. It's like, you're so skeptical. You always want everything to be shown to you. You want to see it before you'll believe it. But there is a sense in which that kind of looking for rational arguments, even if we understand that in the end may not be the be all and end all, that we can't prove transcendent realities necessarily through rational thinking, but that yet there is a real importance to rational thinking and using that sort of knowledge that we do have, questioning things where we don't know the basis for that knowledge. That can be very helpful, even as we don't necessarily take a fully skeptical position, because I think that would be a very anti-Christian position, to go to a full-on skeptical position that just says, we have no possible way of having knowledge, nothing, we can't rely on anything that we know around us. So that's where I've gone on these. Does that make some sense to you? Is that similar for you?
Yeah, it's beautiful. We're in such an interesting situation. I would almost throw out, and I'd love your feedback on this. I would almost throw out that as faith is to Christianity, so also skepticism seems to be to the secular, to the anti theist, to the atheist. And so it's perhaps worth examining how they might fit together. And so the Middle Ages, where we're going to talk about, is, and the authors in works like this will almost say it wistfully, as if they were somehow professionally displeased by this. People will talk about the medieval age as the age of faith, meaning that it was just such a universal quality and quantity in theology, in philosophy, that people just didn't have discussions outside of that frame of reference. And so where we have come, let's say, since that time, and largely due to the secularizing influences of the Renaissance, the modern period, and now I would say in the postmodern period, is, for lack of a better term, skepticism has in some sense been used as a crowbar to pry religious thought in the Christian sense, or maybe we could even say in the general theistic sense, to pry away supernatural from the hinges of Christian thought. And so what that means is during the Middle Ages, there was just a presumption that, in particular, we're going to talk about the discussion involving Henry of Ghent and John Duns Scotus, and this idea of the eternal model, this Platonic Augustinian understanding that reality is created and that there is an underlying and supporting divine illuminator who is connecting the dot, and that ultimately, if people have knowledge, then they have knowledge because this divine illumination is happening. And so the big trend here in the secularized force has been to skeptically doubt that. And one of the reasons why this has been quote unquote successful has just been because we're dealing with the noumenal nature of reality, to put it in Kantian terms. We're not dealing with scientific quantities. We're not dealing with physics. We're dealing with metaphysics. And of course, something like faith is a non-corporeal substance. It's not something that we can sensibly perceive or point to, like we can point to so many other human experiences and knowledge that is built upon that. But so we have to set the stage and ask, are these opening questions that Professor Perler wants to talk about, are they even the right questions? And if not, what are perhaps some other ones? And so the very first thing Professor Perler says in this chapter is, no philosopher in the Christian tradition radically doubted or even denied the possibility possibility that human being can have knowledge. So this is the potential issue. And I want to just throw this out here. Have I interacted with someone who has radically doubted or denied the possibility that human beings can have knowledge? Because if so, presumably, how is it that they could have knowledge of the discussion I'm having with them if there was no possibility for human beings to have knowledge? So already I feel, if I can put it subjectively or let's say prospectively, I feel that this is a little bit of a rigged game. Discussions about skepticism in the modern psyche is largely going to Vegas, placing your money down, seeing a lot of lights and sounds and action, and at the end of everything, doubt and skepticism is what you get as a response. All of them agreed, the professor will say, that our faculties enable us to acquire a wide range of knowledge. Now, the professor will say the main concern is to explain how. And in an academic setting, there's nothing wrong with considering that question. I think the problem comes in considering that maybe how is a secondary issue to that. And what do I mean by that? Chuck, is it a requirement for you to drive an automobile successfully? Is it a requirement that you first understand and explain how you know that internal combustion engines function? Or if you have an electric vehicle, can you explain the physics underlying your vehicle's functionality? Well, no. Lots of people take advantage of the knowledge regarding internal combustion engine or regarding electric vehicles, even if they don't have the ability to explain how. And so almost right away, we're faced with this interesting conundrum. Now, nobody's saying that there's no place to ask about how, but to make how a primary issue instead of a secondary issue seems to obscure the fact that people believe they can make use of knowledge despite not being able to explain that. And so that's actually quite important because it takes skepticism away from being a default presumption and throws it out into the marketplace of ideas. Now, Professor Perler here is talking about an extensive debate or a skeptical crisis. He's, of course, a little bit bemoaning the fact that in the Middle Ages, regarding the Christian faith, there was very little of that amongst philosophers, theologians. But I think we first have to note that's a secondary doctrine, a secondary issue. Ontology is independent of explanation. And so that was a long rant there, and thank you for the patience on that. But I really think that's important in setting the stage. We quickly come to this thing where the common attack is if one cannot explain how, then the thesis is one must not have knowledge. I think we can't just start there. What are your thoughts?